So who was the best Prime Minister we never had? Well, many people can lay claim to the mantle of the best Prime Minister we never had for a multitude of reasons. For example, John Smith and Hugh Gaitskell were removed from having the highest office in the country because of death, which many people would argue would be suspicious deaths, given that both their successors, Harold Wilson and Tony Blair, were probably the most two influential people in the history of the Labour Party, and probably two of the most influential people in British history. Others, for example Rab Butler, was extremely unlucky. He lost out of being Prime Minister twice, in 1957 and in 1963, so which was, I'm sure he would be very angry at. And Dennis Healey, had he been able to win the Labour leadership election in 1980, he would have probably become Prime Minister in either 1983 or 1987, which would have severely cut short her term in office. Then of course there's also what would have happened had Lord Halifax become Prime Minister in 1940 instead of Winston Churchill. Would he have made peace with the Germans, or would he have surrendered to the Germans, or would he have carried on fighting the war? Is of course one of the great unknowns of history. However, most alternative historians, or historians that are projecting what might have happened, seem to have come to the conclusion that he would have probably come to some kind of armistice agreement. Of course, there's also Roy Jenkins, who, until he resigned from the Shadow Cabinet in 1972, was the front runner to succeed Harold Wilson when he resigned, which would have happened in 1976, and he would have therefore been Prime Minister instead of James Callaghan, which of course is quite a significant point, because Roy Jenkins was a much less friendly with trade unions than James Callaghan was, and so he might perhaps have been more forceful and been able to appease the trade unions much more significantly and much better than James Callaghan was able to. There's also the one, what if David Miliband had run against Gordon Brown in 2007? If he had have, there's quite a good reason to believe he might have won and been Prime Minister instead of Gordon Brown. He might have been a more effective politician, a better debater, and he might have led Labour to re-election in 2010 or 2007 is another great what if. One of my personal favourites of the best Prime Minister we never had is Nairin Bevan, who was, until 1951, one of the front runners to succeed Clement Attlee when he retired from leader of the Labour Party, or as Prime Minister had he been re-elected. So a lot of what ifs, but he would have been a much more effective politician, and he was proposing policies, for example, ending all links with South Africa unless they abolished apartheid, of reorganising the economy so that the government owned the commanding heights of it, but that most private business had little intervention from the government. He would have also, well, until he switched on the nuclear issue, ended Britain's nuclear weapons programme. So it is indeed quite significant in a number of things that would have happened had he become Prime Minister. Then there's Austen Chamberlain, the now little known brother of Neville Chamberlain, the infamous appeaser. Austen Chamberlain was a much more on Churchill's lines with regard to Germany, and in 1921 he was the first Conservative leader not to become Prime Minister when Andrew Bonar Law suddenly recovered from his really bad throat cancer, which eventually killed him a year later. That had Austen Chamberlain been in charge, things might have been very different, and the Second World War might have begun 5 years earlier when Germany was still not very prepared. So indeed quite significant people, but had any of these people been Prime Minister, they would have been much, well, in my view, certain ones of them would have been much more effective leaders, others of them would have been absolutely awful leaders, but on the whole, sometimes people make much more of a difference when they're not in Downing Street than if they were in Downing Street. They make much more significant changes in Parliament, or even just in the whole political scene, as it were, than they would inside a little house talking to lots of people in suits and other people not in suits.